You're gonna. Oh, hello there, AP World students. Let's learn all about Africa. Here we go. We're doing it. All right. So, the big sort of theme with Africa in this unit is Africa was connected to the global sphere via the Silk Road and the Trans-Saharan Trade Network and the Monsoon Marketplace. But now Africa is going to have kind of a very specific role in the world economy. It's largely going to be dependent on the slave trade, and Europeans are going to get all involved with that. But still, like, the slave trade is going to dominate the African markets, especially in the later 1600s, 1700s. In the 1500s and early 1600s, Africa was still a pretty vibrant, globally connected marketplace, okay? And what sort of happens during this period of history is Africa transitions from being sort of like a partner in the world trade to being sort of a victim of world trade. And that's actually an argument I think I can take all the way out to the modern day. So we're gonna see sort of Africa's fall from being treated fairly by world history. That's what this is all about. All right, moving on. So, I've already, hopefully you know that slavery was a thing here in the New World. I've already talked about it a little bit in parts 1 and 2, but now I'm really going to give you why Africa. Why were these people taken to this part of the world to do menial slave labor? Well, Africa had farming societies, so a lot of the people who were taken away for slavery did know how to do some of the work that they would be forced to do here. Also, Africans have the largest natural immunities to smallpox, malaria, and yellow fever. Actually, some of the best immunity in the world. Like, my sister, she's lived in Uganda for years, and she's gotten some crazy diseases that I never even heard of. And, one of them had a 10% fatality rate, and she recovered from it fine. It's like, yeah, basically only white people get it. And I was like, oh my gosh. But, originally, Europeans did not bring Africans to the New World. Originally, they were bringing over their serfs, okay? They're these poor white people called indentured servants. And the idea was you would get these poor whites to work on the farms in the tropical Caribbean and the plantations. But those white people continually were dying, okay? It's these mosquitoes and just the diseases in tropical environments just wrecked white people for this entire time period we're talking about here. So Europeans sort of always had to be really like health conscious whenever they were in a tropical part of the world, and they really said, we can't be outside for that long. We've got to have other people do the work, and they're taking people out of Africa to do it. Okay, moving on. So, and really the whole slave trade really got started by the fact that when Christopher Columbus doing the Columbian Exchange and all that, they said, wow, there's some really awesome new foods here in the New World. Foods like sugarcane, tobacco, cocoa, corn, but corn wasn't really a topic of discussion for this purpose. And all three of those kind of big food deals required you to have a tropical environment and to do a whole lot of labor. They're all very labor intensive. There's a whole lot of free tropical land now in the New World because the natives got wiped out from smallpox. So all these uninhabited islands are now going to get populated by a European slave master and bringing over slaves from Africa. And this whole system is called plantation agriculture. I talked about this a lot in human geography class, but I'll cover it right now. Plantation agriculture, it always occurs in a relatively coastal environment, tropical environment, and you're growing a crop that you sort of can't subsist on. You can't eat it yourself and like live your full life. If you're just growing cocoa, I mean, yeah, it'd be great. You get a lot of chocolate, I guess, but it would screw up your diet. Okay, you're not farming for yourself. You're farming for the global marketplace. That is plantation agriculture. And African labor would, of course, be the ideal choice for working in the New World. The first slave ships arrived here in 1518, and they continued all the way. I think the last slave ship was in the 1880s. So, happened for 370 years, bringing people over. Okay, so now why was Africa allowing or participating in the slave trade? Were they resisting it? Were they fighting it? There are examples where they were, but most big African states at this time were very complicit in the slave trade. And it was because Songhai, Morocco, Mali, especially those West African kingdoms, were in almost a constant state of civil war with each other. Well, it's not really a civil war if they're different kingdoms, but West Africa as a whole was constantly fighting each other. And Europeans had these fancy guns. Well, whatever African kingdom had more European weapons definitely had an advantage in these wars. And Europeans first wanted gold for their weapons, and then after a while, Europeans said, the only way we're selling you guns and ammunition is if you give us slaves. And the wars actually continued more and more and more because they wanted to get more slaves and more guns and more violence, and it created this cycle of instability that I'll argue has continued in Africa to this day. So, pretty messed up. Oh yeah, see, I just covered a whole lot of this in my previous slide. But yeah, slaves would be their highest priority for the next 300 years. The primary imported good to Africa would be European guns and ammunition, and occasionally there were African kings who would request for alcohol or for fancy European clothes. Like, I remember reading this primary source in college where I think it was the king of Mali really had a taste for rum, and he said to the slave master, and the slave master or the slave ship captain wrote it down in his journal. He said, if I bring over a bottle of rum, he will trade me a slave. And I read that and I was like, wow, a human life is worth a bottle of liquor. That's just crazy to me. And yeah, so these African kingdoms were complicit in the slave trade, providing the Europeans with slaves from their rival nations. And the vast, vast majority of slaves came from the West Central African coast. So modern day Nigeria, Niger, Benin, Togo. So if there's someone in the Americas who is of descendant of slavery, that is most likely where the ancestors came from. All right, moving on. So yeah, and I mentioned white Europeans, like I think a lot of people have this perception that during this time period, white people were running around Africa with nets and just capturing human bodies and bringing them over. But Europeans never ventured that far into Africa because of all these tropical diseases, yellow fever and malaria that I mentioned earlier. So Europeans hired African slave catchers to be their middlemen, and the whole continent was just turned into this madhouse of these tribal factions fighting against each other, these kingdoms fighting against each other, and it was just who could get more slaves and bring them over to the beaches where Europeans were allowed to set up these sort of like mini castles called slave ports, and a lot of them are actually still there today. I was rather shocked to learn that these buildings were built to last for 500 years. But obviously the slave ports aren't working anymore today, but the relics of the past still exist. And these are the only places where you really would have found white people in Africa. They would dock their ships right off the coast. Europeans would sail up in there. There's not too many bugs along the coast. And they would bring in their goods and trade them for human cargo. All right, now we get into the Middle Passage. So the Middle Passage is this term for when the slave ships would be full of slaves and travel on between Africa to the Americas. And by every way I can imagine it, it was the most horrifying human transportation in the history of the world. Maybe second would be the Auschwitz cattle cars that the Nazis used, but it was probably more deadly to be an African slave in one of these slave ships. Like I've kind of covered most of this, but you can see they stacked up bodies like this. It was ridiculous. Uh, these men would be chained down for, I think it was something like 20 hours a day, given like 4 hours to move around. Um, but yeah, it's truly disgusting, terrible stuff in history. There was no compassion for anybody who was put on these ships and sent to the New World. And I do have these diaries of slave ship captains, and I think one of them said that on a typical voyage, if 75% of our cargo survives, that's good enough for us. I was just like, dang. Like, they don't even want to try to keep these people alive. And yeah, it's just disgusting stuff. Another thing that some oceanologists found out by studying shark patterns over world history is that during this time period, sharks from the northern Atlantic and the southern Atlantic merged together right along the main travel spots. And still to this day, there are more sharks in the central part of the Atlantic Ocean when traditionally they were all spread out. And historians have definitely found the reason why shark patterns changed, and it was because so many dead bodies were thrown overboard. And yeah, I think the statistic is going to be coming up, but it's 25% of everybody who got on a slave ship never made it to the New World. And it's pretty terrible stuff. Okay, 15 million Africans would be enslaved and sent to the New World during this period, and the triangle trade is the general term used for a standard procedure that a trading ship would do during this time period. They would start in Europe, load the ship up with guns and ammunition and random European goods, sail down to the West African kingdoms, park outside of a slave port, offload their European cargo, trade the guns for African slaves, load all the slaves onto their ship, then sail to the New World, offload the slaves, load the ship up with sugar or tobacco or cocoa or gold or silver, and then sail back to Europe. That was a typical deal if you were a ship captain during this time period. And I think I read in the guy's journal, like, you only had to do that trip maybe 6 times in your life, and then you've got enough money to live a comfortable life the rest of your life. So it was very lucrative to participate in this, and I don't think too many Europeans really had moral questions about what they were doing participating in the slave trade, because it's pretty clear from the documents that they did not view Africans as their equals in any way. They viewed them as less than human beings, and that frame of mind is just disgusting. All right, moving on. Here's something else too. Only 4% of slaves would end up in what will become the southern United States. The vast majority of slaves taken out of Africa were sent to the West Indies and to Brazil. And that's why still to this day, you can go to islands like Haiti, Barbados, St. Martin, St. Lucia. Almost everybody living in the Caribbean today is of African descent. And they were all brought over there during this time period, during the slave trade. And so the experience of African Americans that we're all hopefully quite familiar with living in the United States, it's just shocking to me that only a tiny fraction of slaves ended up here, and that the expanse of this system was just overwhelming. There actually was a brief moment in history where there were more people of African descent in the New Worlds than there were of people of white descent. That didn't last, but I was still just really shocked to figure that out, to be like, wow, like, there was a time when black people outnumbered white people in the Americas. And so, yeah, it just shows you the scale of the slave trade. It's just unbelievable almost. But yeah, the whole goal of the slave trade was to produce these cash crops that you're growing on the plantations. Sugar and sugarcane is definitely the biggest crop. Tobacco, coffee, and then later cotton will also be plantation crops mostly utilized by the slave trade. And yeah, I've already alluded to this a little bit, but racist beliefs held by Europeans thought that Africans were animals and should be treated as such. Oh yeah, see, during this time there were more black slaves than white slave owners. Well, and that was always the case, but there were actually more black people than white people, slave owners aside. And I really think that it comes down to this. Europe was always this kind of backwater, neglected place before the Renaissance. And now that Europe has entered the world stage, they don't have the same levels of societal interactions that, like, for example, the gunpowder empires had, being along the Silk Road. And when they've encountered Africans, so many Europeans had never seen an African or never really had the idea of an African. So they really didn't have any concept of how a multicultural society would work. So once they got to the New World, they copied what Spain was already doing and saying, let's create a societal system based on race. And there's been so many examples of slavery over the course of world history, and I've studied many of them. And I think I can confidently say that the system of slavery that was utilized in the New World was by far the most brutal. It was way more brutal than even ancient Rome and ancient Greece. It was just, there were so many laws that defined slaves as non-humans. And even in ancient Rome, there were laws that allowed some rights to slaves. I mean, there weren't a lot of rights, but I mean, we already know the Ottoman Empire, they had muktaba laws that benefited their slaves, but Europeans didn't do anything like that. So, really disgusting stuff. Yeah, and yeah, I've got a lot of primary documents about slavery and what happened here in the New World, but it's truly brutal, brutal stuff, kids. Okay, and now let's talk about slavery's effect on Africa itself. Most of the slave trade, owners actually discouraged their slaves from having families. And I thought this whole concept was really wild too when I learned about it. But slave owners did the math, and they said, well, I could make my man slave and my female slave have a baby, but then I gotta wait 18 years to have an effective worker. It's cheaper for me to just send a ship to Africa loaded with guns and European goods and trade it for another human body than it is to actually raise an African child in the New World. So that's just pretty insane to me that they discouraged reproduction in the New World. That changed starting in the 1800s once the slave trade started to get more and more more and more put down by some European powers. But since men were generally considered better workers in labor, 70% of all slaves taken from Africa were men. It definitely means that a vast majority of the slaves have no ancestors in the New World. There were just millions of slaves that were taken from Africa, brought to the New World, and they never had children of their own, and their families just died out. So Africa lost 10 million men, left many parts of West Africa vulnerable to attacks and raids, left that part of the world without a lot of stability that continues to this day. And African countries where the most slaves are taken were some of the poorest countries in the world today. So it's just really shocking that countries like Mali were doing conceivably pretty well in the 1500s, and today Mali's not looking great. And I mean, I think Africa is improving a lot in the modern world, but historically speaking, this was where Africa basically got a knockout blow, and it's there needs to be some rectification for what has occurred in the past. Um, it's pretty messed up stuff. All right, so there we go. Moving on. Okay, and I do want to emphasize though that it wasn't that these Africans who were sent to the New World were not pushovers. Okay, there were numerous times when African slaves ran away from their plantations or where they fought back. But most of the time, whenever there was an uprising, it was put down brutally. But there were many examples of slaves that ran away from their plantations, went deep in the middle of these big old islands in the Caribbean, or found some kind of hidden island somewhere away from their plantations, and they set up their own societies. These are collectively called maroon societies. And when Europeans were like, oh man, we got to go into the swamp and find out where all those runaway slaves are, they would go into the swamp, mosquitoes would bite them, they get malaria, and they die. So it didn't really work out for them. Yeah, there are many examples of these maroon societies, actually, and they were just kind of collectively independent and aside from the plantation system. Actually, later, there would be a slave revolt in Jamaica called the Maroon Wars, and I think, if memory serves correctly, the slaves win that war, and they just win their personal independence. So I thought that was kind of cool. But yeah, slave resistance will be consistent throughout the history of slavery in the New World, and it definitely shows the unjust nature of this system. Let me mention too, these maroon societies did usually create these sort of alliances with Native Americans, and it's pretty common if you meet someone who's a Native American that they will have some African blood in them, because there was this sort of alliance of opposition against European powers in the New World. So cultural synthesis. So African American culture. Hey, it's pretty awesome culture. Synthesis of European music and religion with African music and religions. We could do a whole study of Baptist Christianity, and especially how it's adapted in the African American community, and you could see there are elements of traditional African religions that appear in this version of Christianity. And the same thing with how once Africans got their hands on European musical instruments, they created all kinds of new styles of music. I mean, jazz comes to mind, blues comes to mind, and that later evolves into R&B, hip-hop, and rap. And it all is kind of this mix of two worlds of music that all develops over history. Some foods are even brought from Africa and utilized in New World syncretic food dishes. I'm definitely not an expert on all that, but I would hope that if we were in a live class, I'd have some students that could tell me of how the food culture also merged when these new societies all came together. Something that I think is just super cool is Voodoo, also called Vodoun Culture, and it's a three-way cultural synthesis of West African religions, Native American religions, and European Christianity, and it's widely practiced in the Caribbean, especially if you go to like Jamaica and some of those islands in the Caribbean there. You know, it's like the voodoo dolls, and it's cool stuff. So American voodoo, ooh, new religions happening in the New World. All right, and I'll save this one for the next time. That's it for me. Peace out.